Welcome back to Alejandro Yamashita and Martin Despang's show Urban Transcendence on this, once again, beautiful Thursday here in downtown Honolulu at the Pioneers Plaza in the ThinkTech Hawaii studio. So today we're going to have a show that's about someone visiting us who's only here for a very few days. So the show is, amongst many things, about globalism and caring about the world, and then sort of trickle it down to this beautiful place of Hawaii, Honolulu, where we're privileged to live. So we take advantage whenever we can to bring people in from the outside to give us sort of outside-in perspectives, because us, we just talked with Jay that we live here, you know, we tend to basically forget, never about the beauty, hopefully, but sometimes about the problems, because we have to live on a daily basis and kind of close our eyes at times. So this is a great opportunity. This is also a joint venture event with the School of Architecture, where today's guest yesterday gave a very well-received lecture, and today he's here with us. And whereas the whole approach of ThinkTech Hawaii is about diversification, then it's broken down into sort of resorts and chapters, and us being sort of the urban one. I think we have established a little tradition of then within this sort of specialization of our topic to get people who have a broader view. In fact, next week's show is going to be Thomas Lim family, who has been patient to coming on the show, and the show will be titled The Bigger Picture. And that could have been as well the title for today's show, because we have someone here, our guest, Professor Ulf Meyer, is in the best nature of the sense a jack of all trades, which is something that actually has been building America, then over the years of its progressing or degressing, been sort of stigmatized or discriminated, and more or less recently gets kind of rediscovered. So we have many people in one person here, sitting here, and we have only 45 minutes, so I better let you talk now. Ulf, thank you very much for being here, but very briefly, you are a German-born and raised architect who ever since has been all over the world in many different functions. And as to give it a start off, you're an architect, but you're what I call a practicator. So you practiced architecture, and you also educate people about the subject matter. So why don't we start off talking about your practice experience and where you had your apprentice years, your heydays, and then how do you move on from there? So, but first of all, again, thank you for being here, Ulf. It's a pleasure and honor.
Oh, thank you for hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much. Yeah, there were some interesting moments in my career so far, my architectural career so far. One decisive moment certainly was my short time in Japan, working in Tokyo for a very famous architect of the name Shigeru Ban, who actually has won the Pritzker Prize for Architecture for his lifetime achievement this year. Mm-hmm. It happened so that I was invited to attend the ceremony where he was awarded that very prestigious prize in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. So looking back at my time with this famous architect, I have to say it was a decisive time for his career as much as mine, I guess. Mm-hmm. Being exposed to a world that I didn't have the words for. Mm-hmm. As an architect living in an East Asian metropolis, I felt rather challenged. Mm-hmm. by the notion that I thought I didn't have the words to describe mm-hmm. the urban and architectural phenomena mm-hmm. that I was exposed to, and I still feel that way actually after having visited many Asian metropolises over many years. I still feel that same way in a way, mm-hmm. that things are hard to describe. Mm-hmm. Just giving things a name is a challenge in mm-hmm. itself, mm-hmm. and it's a good first step to mm-hmm. Try to do that.
Mm-hmm. Zuri has some pictures floating for us here in the background. So they're kind of a loop, and some we want to refer to are actually rather small buildings, two of them, yeah. who look, to say the least, non-traditional. Right. And that's something we thought is why we put them in there. Also relates very much potentially to why here. Maybe you want to talk about that part of Bach's
Definitely.
work.
Well, I think the Pritzker jury and kind of the world public feels or felt that he would be the right choice for this prestigious award, not least because he became famous for two things, most of all. One is the rediscovery and reintroduction of paper and cardboard, two traditional materials used in Japanese architecture, into contemporary architecture. Another, maybe even more important thing was he, as the first boutique kind of high-profile, avant-garde, American-trained architect, did something very smart and very meaningful, and that is he thought looking at refugees and people looking for shelter from man-made or natural disasters should get the attention of high-profile architects. Mm-hmm. And why not? Mm-hmm. And he did exactly that, actually using paper and cardboard in many cases. And just because of that alone, I think it is very justified to give him a famous award like that, because unfortunately the times we live in, the number of refugees is actually exploding like never before. The UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, is a very busy person these days. There's many civil wars going on, and wars, and natural disasters of all kinds, and they certainly have reached the shores of the Western civilized world. Japan, of course, comes to mind. They've gone through some horrible energy-related, but also nature-related crisis, causing many people to lose their home. So it's not always them, it's actually us who are in the focus of that endeavor as well.
So I know why we can say, you get me going thinking about that, maybe we're kind of consumerism and capitalist endangered here or invaded, so to speak, right? Because we have some issues here about people making a living here. Tourists stumble over homeless. It's a big subject matter in the news. How do you deal with that? And then there's many local people of different kinds. People try to make a living and can't. So I think this is an issue that's very, very pressing also for the islands and potentially learn from. So one is the cardboard, and there's another project that shows something that's very familiar to us here on the islands. You want to talk about that potential?
Well, you're referring to the container.
Building material, yes.
Yeah. Actually, containers get mass-produced these days. Trade across oceans is growing quite a bit, especially between East Asia and Europe and North America. And these containers are surprisingly cheap. They're actually so cheap that it's not economic to send them back empty. They actually get disposed of. Well, no need to tell you that that calls for an architectural innovation, because they're basically around and they provide a very, very basic kind of shelter. However, many architects are fascinated with containers. Not everybody's as clever as you are, knowing and understanding very well that to make them thermally comfortable does take some effort, especially in a climate like you enjoy here in Hawaii.
Yeah, and we had a show about that, so if people want to revisit that, that was with the sort of author, and this is interesting because we come to the part of you being an author as well. So the author of the Container Atlas about container architecture, Hans Slavik, so people can revisit that if they're interested in that. So I think moving on, you very early in your career, you also started to give back to. We should complete, I think, your CV. We kind of, give them to the audience in bits and pieces rather than at the very beginning, because it makes more sense in your case. So you've been educated at the famous Illinois Institute of Technology, which is sort of basically Mies van der Rohe's school. We just had a little morning chat with Alejandri, our co-host, and you met her yesterday. And so she was pointing out to the Farnsworth House as an architectural icon, which is also rather simple. You can call it a frame container. Hans Slavik calls the ones that only have the corners basically frame containers. So you were partly educated there, and then as well at the very prestigious technical university in Berlin. And ever since you had a long tradition of you being an educator as well, but less sort of being at one place, but I think to the benefit of you and your students traveling around the world, and maybe you can share a little bit with which these stops were, and especially where you're right now.
Yeah, it really all started with me having the privilege to conduct some summer schools for students from different countries, the United States of America, also Turkey and other countries, who would come to my hometown, Berlin, Germany, which actually is known amongst architects as much as amongst non-architects for being rather rich in the architectural heritage terms, so it makes a good destination for anybody with an architectural eye. And then it happened so that I was asked to become a professor at 2 different schools in the Midwest of the US, in Kansas and Nebraska, and I enjoyed myself there for 3 years' time. And currently I'm teaching at the Tamkang University, which is a private university just north of Taipei, Taiwan, which I also find to be very fascinating, especially comparing my experiences in both places.
And the Zuri has always done a perfect job. We see a picture here of a very recent student's work, which very much made me sentimental, because the student's first name is the name of my oldest son, Joey. So hi, Joey, by the way, if you watch the show. So what interested me, and why when we talked, prepared for the show, why we choose that picture, is that also something that has to do with our cultural and industrial landscape here, basically, is that you're not interested in sort of just, staying on the exclusive and basically working on land that maybe should better be preserved. You're looking at the urban grit as coming from nitty-gritty, so maybe you can talk about that sort of approach of that studio.
Honolulu is not alone in suffering from urban sprawl. There's quite a bit of that in town, actually, as there is in the world. And one little way to counter that, other than traffic, I think is a key driver also, but one other factor is we should revisit our brownfield sites more. And this student project that you just talked about is such a brownfield project. There's a airport in downtown Taipei, actually almost in the middle of the city, traditionally mainly used for domestic flights, that will be closed down. So I asked my students to dream up a proposal of how that city could grow into this site in a good way. And I have to say I'm very proud of my students' achievements. I think they did a fabulous job of dreaming up such a future.
Definitely. So other pictures that we see floating around are about many things, and they're about different scales. I think that's something that you also, through all your experience as an architect yourself, basically in small scale, low-tech, low-end, Shigeru Ban's sort of resilience design. We could talk about it these days. And it's interesting, yesterday you showed a picture which we haven't included today, which is the pavilion for the expo in 2000 in my hometown in Hanover, and which we haven't addressed yesterday, and save it for today because it's the more critical format, maybe, even, for sure. Is that it was a big scandal that Shigeru Ban was basically sort of like beaten up by the German Hanoverian authorities in making him reinforce the thing with more steel and other materials. So what worked in his own culture, basically, right, was then sort of getting questioned and discriminated in a foreign culture. And to my knowledge, it was to a point that he said, well, I don't want to be associated, I don't want to be the author of that work. So that's something we talked, again, you've only or barely been here 2 days, but we talk and reflect a lot wherever we went and drove about civilization as being a progression, or maybe the other way. So
in that case, I think it was a kind of typical conflict between an architect bringing in a new material, in this case hollow cardboard tubes, and the fire code not being ready for that kind of question. And if the code is not ready for a question, the answer will always be no. So since I know that you're interested in wooden architecture, I will point out that when I worked for Shigeru Ban, I once visited his project in Osaka, Japan, called the GC building, which is a steel skeleton building, and the steel is clad in wood. So wood is used as a fireproofing material for a steel building. When I first saw it, I rubbed my eyes and thought, which kind of apprentice designed this one. There must be something fundamentally wrong here. But turns out actually wood can be used as a fireproofing material even. In case of a fire, direct exposure to fire will turn it to charcoal, which in turn is actually an excellent fireproofing material. So I think our fire codes have gone crazy, frankly, and they actually often hinder innovation.
That is super exciting. Hold that thought. We're going to do a little commercial, and we're going to be right back with today's guest, Ulf Meyer. And actually his topic talk, which you see in the picture, is called Sustainability.
Thank you.
See you soon back.
Aloha, my name is Kenneth Lawson. I'm your host here at Life in the Law. I'm really interested in law as I practiced it for 18 years before coming to Hawaii. I practiced criminal law and civil rights law on the mainland. Now I teach law at the University of Hawaii Law School, William S. Richardson School of Law. And I bring in guests who are very current on legal issues that affect your life here in Hawaii. Come and join me every Wednesday at 1 p.m. as we explore how the law affects you, how the law is changing, and why it's important that you should care about what's going on in your community. See you then.
All right, welcome back to our guest, Ulf Meyer, today. We just stopped at a totally exciting point. They were talking about conventions, societal conventions, and what they do. And originally they intend good things, but then, as you implied, they get out of control. They become codes and regulations. And we both being German, we're actually sort of the masters in that. The Deutsche DIN-Norm, for example, is that, basically. And you were talking about sort of unconventional ways, and sometimes, reconnecting to things that we basically knew. So that makes us more open to open a view beyond the stereotypical, and allows us, more maybe clever things to do. So with the shipping container, for example, whenever, I have one project envisioned to do with that, and I bounce it off different people at different times, and the most recent comment was, well, Martin, this won't fly. You're a dreamer, because the union will fight that, because they're actually interested in 2x4 sticks, because there's a lot of labor in there. And that's a good thing to keep people employed, but yet if you don't reach the critical masses of the low-income people, then that's maybe gets to the question of being ethical or unethical. So I think, your point is right on to say we should rethink the way we think, and that should basically trickle through to the rules and regulations / codes. And I can just share, and I've did before, Howard Wick, who got me on the show, to begin with, is very, very instrumental in trying to do that. So we need to have, bottom up and top down to really kind of make the change, the urban transcendence transition that we're kind of talking about, right?
I think at this point viewers have seen in the background an image depicting the terrible tragedy that struck in northeastern Japan in the Tohoku region three years ago. No need to remind viewers, the terrible sea quake actually caused not only multiple nuclear meltdown, but also total devastation in a town called, amongst others, Minami Sanriku. And those pictures show that. Interestingly, and ironically, there was one building, a public building, and at the moment the tsunami struck, they had a public safety meeting there. The mayor of the town canceled the meeting, obviously, and ran up to the rooftop terrace, hoping that he wouldn't get washed away. Actually, people held on to a steel pole, and within minutes the town was literally erased. There is not a single building remained standing other than the hollowed out steel structure of that building that they were in. And even those people who made it up to the rooftop terrace, although that's a 3 or 4 story building, the tsunami actually was higher than that, got washed away and died. The mayor survived, I believe, and left this hollowed out steel structure as a reminder now, as a memorial. So coming back to the notion of ephemeral materials versus resilient materials, and I know you're interested in containers, which are made of steel as well. It may be a symbol now that the steel building survived while the wooden buildings got washed away there. Shigeru Ban, I mentioned earlier, was known for the use of cardboard tubes more than anything else. You may be surprised to find that for the refugee shelter for the people who suffered from the tsunami in Tohoku, he used steel containers as well. Until today, it's not publicly known. It's actually kind of under the swept under the carpet. Thousands of people in wealthy Japan still live in very, very poor makeshift shelter, and the society doesn't care about them all that much. Rather, they now focus on Tokyo hosting the 2020 Summer Olympic Games. Obviously, that's a happier thing to look forward to. In a way, that is actually bad for the refugees.
So it's a good play to be more open, to look at things, more innovatively, more progressively. One of my students who was looking, many of my students, I encourage him to look at what do we have as building materials here, and we went through that, kind of reflecting our way here. You see a lot of concrete and see some steel, and the question is why? Why do we do it? It's mostly driven by costs, but there should be other thought processes behind. So one of the students basically, and we actually mentioned that in the very early show that Alejandro and I were the guests, that a Heineken bottle might be, as Alejandro worked for Heineken, might be an abundant building material because there are so many out there. And for the same reason, glass isn't been recycled here, so they basically go back. What an effort, what a waste. So we're not making buildings, that we incorporate things that maybe not traditionally, but we don't live in a traditional society anymore with all the means and methods. We live in a highly civilized, but we don't seem to use the intellect we're naturally equipped with to take advantage of the situation.
Well, by reducing Hawaii's dependence on imports in the architectural sector, you may actually gain more than twice. You will gain for the dependence on natural resources. You'll consume less energy for transportation for over thousands of miles. Thirdly, maybe for me, from a cultural point of view, the most important advantage may be using local materials may make architects come to a more vernacular or contemporary vernacular style. Because with the import of materials, chances are you will also import a style, because certain materials come with certain tectonics, certainly interrelated. And Hawaii obviously is very spoiled by nature in almost any way. So there's scenic beauty, there's great vegetation, there's great beaches, there's great weather. I mean, it's all kind of attractive in almost any way. And that may have made the local architectural scene a little lazy almost, because it seems as if you can build anything in Honolulu. People are going to like it or not care. People don't come here for architecture. People come here to have a good time. And so it seems as if Honolulu doesn't really need good architecture to be an attractive destination, which in a way is fine, but there's also some danger in that, because you don't want to overstretch your privileged spot there.
I think this is much appreciated what you just said. It's actually also much encouraged by Jay, who said, we should talk about, we want to bring it on the table. The audience at this point might say, well, he probably might be more than just a practicator. Sure, he's a good architect, and he's also a good educator, but there must be more. And that's what these books here already point out on the table. What you're doing here is actually part of your profession. You are a professional architectural person. You're critical about architecture, and you make this part of your life, both because of necessity, because we all need to make a living, and more importantly, you do it because you're passionate about it, because you care for the urban environment. So it actually got you to a point to become one of the most productive current authors of tour guides for cities, and especially for us being the most eastern gate to the Asian realm and rim. Please talk about this work, which is huge for me, and we're going to show a little bit and open and put the books into the camera, and Zuri helps us to share that with the audience.
I've literally written over 1,000 articles about architecture and urban design in my life. You might think, well, he's a simple mind, he just doesn't get tired of what he's doing. And I don't. Actually, I'm still very passionate about architectural writing. I do it almost every day of my life, literally. And I'm very passionate about it still, which is maybe surprising. The reason why I am is because architecture is the one art that people cannot escape. If you don't like music, you don't have to go to a concert. If you don't like fine art, you don't have to go to a museum. But try to live without architecture, it's virtually impossible. We're surrounded by architecture almost 24/7. Almost every day of our lives we spend in and around buildings. We get born into buildings, we die in buildings. We're exposed to buildings and the built environment literally every day, except if you're in Antarctica or in the desert. Those are the only spots where that isn't true. So that's why I think, since that art form is so omnipresent, you may as well make friends with it.
And I've been personally privileged to have been reviewed by you, and I love your way of writing, and most importantly, you take the time to actually visit the buildings. In most cases, you insist on visiting the buildings, which is rather rare, which the audience might say, well, we thought that's anyways the case. How can you talk about something you haven't seen? But unfortunately, again, to consumerism, capitalism, laziness, right, all these factors together also affected and invaded the discipline of architectural criticism, in making people not look at it anymore and just write what they think they might see or what the architect has written, which is highly subjective. So it's not really critical, right?
My best friend is a photographer, and I always argue with him. Are journalists or photographers the more notorious liars? Because there's no answer to that. Both are, journalism and photography can be rather misleading. Sometimes they want to be misleading even. Sometimes it's purposely done. So one thing I'm sure about is that architecture needs to be experienced. It's a spatial art. You can't judge it from words or pictures. Oftentimes, almost all the times, you will be surprised. It can be a pleasant surprise. It can also often be an unpleasant surprise. But almost always are you surprised to see a building that you thought you knew well from the pictures or plans or both. You have to go out and experience architecture. So whenever possible, yes, I do try to see the buildings.
Architecture as a spatial art, I can say wow, and I know that Jay is like cheering up next door and celebrating that term and reusing it, you know, for very great purposes. I think I've been the one that you, for certain circumstances, maybe that's a little anecdote because you're great about anecdotes, that one of my buildings you reviewed, I think, had the shortest review time. Maybe you want to just spend 2 sentences about that.
Before I do that, I will be vain and point out that actually it was a German art historian who first coined the phrase that we now take for granted, that architecture is the art of space making rather than the art of building. He, for the first time, thought, well, walls are not built for the sake of building walls. Walls are built to contain a space between them. Sounds kind of natural to us today, but intellectually it took the 19th century some time to get to that point, that architecture actually is not about building material. It's about building a space that is contained by material, which actually makes all the difference. It's the good old Louis Kahn positive and negative thinking or approach to architecture. But coming back to this review, of course, sometimes life has other demands, and you, I think, referred to a short visit during a blizzard in northern Germany that caused a great train delay. And in a way it turned out well, because not only was my train coming into town delayed by exactly the amount of time that I thought I would need to review the building, but also the outgoing train was. So in the end it worked out just fine, but of course it was a little nerve-wracking.
It probably was 5 minutes or something we literally ran through. But again, I had that in rare cases, so I really, really want to compliment you on that. And the same sort of, you know, rigor and seriousness and passion goes into these books here. And I'm just going to, Zura is nicely showing the background picture of where we have, you know, show 3 of the books, but I just want to open the books and just give you an idea how thoroughly they are basically done as far as piece of art themselves. They're very, very well crafted. You have an excellent publisher, I think we have to say.
The designer is a German-Japanese lady. I'll give that compliment to her. Yuko Stier is her name. She did a good job. I agree with you. Thank you for that compliment. Now, coming back to the Asian metropolises overwhelming people and architecture being the one unavoidable art, that for these 2 reasons, I think these books make sense. Because if you leave your airport in a place like Hong Kong, Tokyo, or Taiwan, or elsewhere, and go to town, you will most likely also be overwhelmed by those cities. So I think it makes sense to have such a guidebook accompany you through town.
So it starts with aerial overviews that Alejandra loved very much yesterday in your lecture. She said you hardly ever see cities like that unless you hike Diamond Head here, or Cocoa Head, or you go somewhere up, but usually you don't perceive cities like that. It's only birds that have the privilege. So it gives you a very great overview of sort of the nature of the urban fabric. And then obviously then you basically go down to the individual buildings, and they're documented well with images, and then you're very, very, pointed and analytical texts, that try to get to the nature of the beast, to the soul of the building, what's the context, but still in a way that the usual sort of average, I would say, sort of interested person can comprehend it.
Oh, they're kind of short and no-nonsense things. Since you have the book open now, you tempt me to point out one thing that I'm most proud of. I tortured my poor wife to help me fabricate these maps, because many people know Tokyo is a city without street names or addresses, so places are hard to find. So actually using a very sophisticated software, many hours it was actually made in Kansas. We did these neighborhood maps that will help visitors find the buildings that they like.
And we're going to take the last break, and then we're going to be back with our today's guest, Professor Ulf Meyer.
Aloha, hello. My name is Hong Jiang, and I host ThinkTech Asia every Tuesday afternoon at 4 p.m. At our show, we talk about issues that are important in Asia, such as environment, culture, history, religion. We broadcast live, and we're also on Olelo 54. Make sure to tune in, and we'll see you there. Thank you. Goodbye.
So welcome back to today's Urban Transcendence with Professor Ulf Meyer, and the topic, the broad umbrella topic, is sustainability, which obviously needs little explanation, but it's playing with sort of the inflated word and deflated word sustainability, and tries to rethink that term. And that's also something that, when you talk about these buildings here, you do it almost as an architectural, not almost, you do it as an architectural critic, as a theorist, as a historian in some way. But when you're actually engaged personally in architecture, and also your choice when you write for magazines, for example, you have a tendency to gravitate towards environmentally friendly, ecological architecture, one can say. And we talk a little bit about, because there's one project here that probably the audience gets excited about, because the visual is very powerful. It's a tall building with a courtyard in the middle that's highly vegetated. Maybe you talk about the architect that you're very close to as well.
There's an architect in Düsseldorf, Germany, called Ingenhofen. The firm's called Ingenhofen Architect, and they're unusual by German standards in that they really work almost all over the world, including the Western Pacific Rim, places like Japan, Australia, or more recently Singapore. And although they are famous for having developed a way to build in an environmentally friendly style in Europe, they really had to adapt and rediscover and reverse engineer their own know-how, working in very different cultures and societies and climate zones, of course. Singapore, since you pointed it out, is very close to the equator, has almost no seasons, is almost always hot and humid, making it not all that dissimilar from the climate that you have here in Honolulu. So really you can't copy and paste the solution in architecture that you once developed for one particular site. In a way that makes our profession difficult. In another way, it makes our profession very rich, I think, because you can't have that one-size-fits-all kind of mentality. You actually have to work with local conditions and redesign the existing.
Yeah, that's what some of us like to call glocal, that hybridism, and I think it's interesting. You're right on and very blunt, as you can actually afford, because you're a critic, right? Where most people always have to be careful to not offend. It's part of actually your mission is to be offensive, not to be hurtful, but to be helpful, right? So when you look at, I really enjoy your fresh view about driving through the city from point here to point there. And you're sort of also ambivalent, I think, about the city, that you're excited about it. Thank you for being here and being excited about it. On the other hand, just very much like we've known each other for a long time, so no surprise, you're also worried about the city, that the city sort of is is sort of separating itself from actually what Hawaii is about, which is about the beauty, and which is about Pono, which means Hawaiian for balance. And so the architecture of Ingenhofen, for example, got Wendy Maguro yesterday, who's our sustainability colleague at the School of Architecture, got her really excited to say, well, maybe in Ingenhofen, not him as an architect, we don't want to promote any or the other architect, but maybe an approach, an Ingenhofen approach to basically look at things. And we have this interesting controversial going on that I tell my students, avoid glass. And the buildings you show with Ingenhofen actually have a lot of glass. They actually have twice as much glass as conventional buildings, which are double facades, which I think is interesting that there isn't just one way. There are different ways, and to weigh these ways, and they're all innovative. They're just innovative in a different way, and that way you actually get diversity, and that's something that nature also has, and makes actually nature so beautiful, because it's just one monoculture.
We as architects like to think of ourselves as pioneers and inventors, and we make these great discoveries. Frankly, I mean, it's all already on the table already. Self-shading facades make total sense. Well-ventilated and well-daylit buildings make total sense. And they've been around for literally thousands of years. I mean, the vernacular architecture seems to embody all the wisdom that we that we try hard to rediscover. So really looking at nature's principles and vernacular architecture's principles will always be a good advice. Now, when you still want to be built tall, which obviously in Honolulu people do, and there's some beauty to that because it will come with urban density if you do it right, which will decrease the distance, the need for traveling long distances and so forth. If you want to build tall and have a well-shaded building, you may come to the point that you want external screens. In tall buildings, the wind will be rather strong and want to play with those screens. So for reasons such as that, a double facade may make sense even in Hawaii climate. But again, I'm not saying the double glass facade is the way to go. It's the one formula that will cause any problem. It certainly isn't like that. So vegetation is another friend of yours in architecture, I think. Singapore, just like Hawaii, has a very forgiving vegetation, unlike Central Europe, where a lot more care and maintenance is required. To use vegetation for shading, for purification of air, for cooling as well. So it really comes with a bundle of benefits. So I think the elements are all out on the table. It just takes contemporary architects to put them together.
So you actually you visit us and you bring, great input and great value through your lens. But you also are really, although you have only been here 2 days less, you're so excited that you say you could actually think that something like this here could happen for Honolulu as well. That would be totally exciting. As of now, the only, to my knowledge, and you're the more expert, so you might correct me, but we talked about it before, so I'm afraid in that case there isn't. I'm right, because the only tour guide I know is from the Phaidon, the London-based publisher, together with a Wallpaper magazine, their travel guides, and it's a nice pocket book. It's fairly outdated by now. Actually, the parts of the culinary and gastronomy, we yesterday took you out at the lecture to the town restaurant, was wonderful. But that's about the only restaurant that's actually still in operation because there's so much change and dynamics going on in that kind of typology. So there would actually be the necessity for, and the urgency, I would say, for a tour guide. And I think you would be most qualified because your agenda and your premise is not based on bias and sort of a preoccupation or prejudice, or by who is the architect I like the most, because you come from the outside, your fresh view. You would actually run them through your critical filter of cultural / climatic and other sort of informing factors, and then put them on a list. And that book could literally and figuratively put it in our face, and basically saying, well, these are the lessons to learn. Before we reinvent the wheel, we might want to make ourselves aware there is a wheel, and maybe by turning the wheel a little bit, that would do it. And you saw many buildings that depressed you, to be honest, and these are the ones probably you shouldn't make it in the book. And then there are many buildings that got you really, really excited, where you saw these values of a blend and you liked in your lecture, you perfectly called it that architecture should be more performance-based.
Oh, I'd love to do it. I mean, you may think this guy is crazy now. He doesn't know town, yet he wants to write a book about it, which sounds totally contradictory. And in a way, it isn't, I think, for reasons that you started to sketch. Being a complete outsider can often, for a journalist or writer, can be a great advantage, actually. Of course, I wouldn't write it like that. I would do my homework and do some research, but not knowing anybody or anything often is a very good thing, because you don't come with a biased view or preconception. So I'll definitely do it in a heartbeat. I would love to do that. And I would include buildings that I dislike as well, because I don't think my personal subjective point of view should be the benchmark. Actually, I included many buildings in these books that would be my personal favorites, just because I tried to make their significance the factor rather than their supposed beauty. I thought buildings of certain typologies, certain eras, certain architects for sure, also certain places should be included, whether or not I like them or think they're good buildings.
That's a very honorable approach once again. So just to make a little bit, I mean, it's not even, you don't need promotion, these sell really well, but the one that we were holding up was Tokyo architecture, then there's Hong Kong architecture, there's also architecture in Taiwan, and there is a new one about Seoul that's with a different publisher, so you just basically, hate to say because it's kind of sloppy, but you pop them out, like, and and there's solid work in there, I know, so it's amazing how you do all this at the same time. So we're kind of getting closer to the end of the show, and I think we shouldn't leave the show without pointing another facet out of you, which is the one of a curator. And actually our main background image is actually about the curatorial work. And I want to include maybe a little bit, because it's curatorial as well, which was your very recent writer in residence at the Paul Rudolph Foundation. Maybe we just spend a couple of words about Paul Rudolph and possible analogies to
that would be great.
Here.
He's kind of out of fashion, I believe. Many of his buildings get knocked down. They'll be gone forever. So that's troubling news, and the Rudolph Foundation tries its best to stop that, but it's not easy to reverse the current. Actually, if you look at him, you'll be surprised, because there's a kind of that stereotype out there that post-war modernist architecture didn't care about places. It was all about the international style. They kind of neglected the local climate. If you look at it in more detail, you'll find just the opposite is actually often true. And Paul Rudolph is a good example of that. He was actually quite sensitive to these issues. He, like other modernist architects, Moshe Safdie comes to mind, they have actually worked in subtropical climates in Singapore and elsewhere, in Hong Kong obviously, in the case of Paul Rudolph as well, with the Lippo Bank building. And they found some rather fascinating solutions for working in these climates that were foreign to them as well. They used the self-shading, they used the vegetation, they used the blinds, they used the brise-soleil, and they were mainstream modernist post-war architects, some of the peers of their top of their peers. So actually I think we should reverse our critique of the 60s architecture in that regard. Actually, if you drive through Honolulu, you will sometimes think it's almost as if we moved a step back from the 60s. Whoa, that would be terrible news. Some more recent buildings actually that popped up seem to totally disregard any consideration for local context or a reaction to local climate altogether. So I think we should not be too happy and not be too self-confident and not be too critical for our appreciation of the 60s architecture. And there were some seeds there that we should nurture.
Well, definitely his Florida era, Paul Rudolph was the umbrella house and other things. And with that, he's very similar to probably our most treasure from these times, which is Vladimir Osipov, who you saw the IBM building and others. So that's kind of this tradition. So with that, there's the main picture in the background is another work of yours that has to do with curating on a very, very high level. The picture we see is on the 2012 Architectural Biennale in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Right?
Well, really, I should give credit to the artist that I had the honor of curating there. Hans-Georg Esch from Germany, I would like to think he's the best architectural photographer maybe in the world that we live in today. And he did a rather fantastic, literally fantastic endeavor. He made it his goal to visit any Chinese cities that would have more than 3 million inhabitants. And you may think, well, that could be easily done. There's over 30 cities like that the world has never heard about. Now we may know Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong, everybody knows those, and Shenzhen and Guangzhou may also resonate. But have you heard about Harbin or Wuxi or these kinds of places, kind of not on the mental map in the Western world? These are thriving, growing, big metropolises. They are actually the urban future of mankind. And he portrayed these cities in a series called The Unknown Cities, in a kind of cool, maybe German neutral style. I very much like that kind of distanced look. And now bringing photos of Chinese cities taken by a German photographer back to China, I thought was quite the interesting undertaking, because even the title Unknown Cities all of a sudden seemed provocative, because obviously in China these cities are not only unknown, they're actually the home to millions of people. So still, it wasn't silly, it was actually also well received, because even within China, again, nobody has that kind of outsider view. There is no other person that would document these growing cities of our times. One day in the 22nd century, people will look back at our times. Most likely they won't talk about Hanover or Honolulu. They will talk about the Pacific century and the enormous city growth in the east of China.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I put out a vision. Hopefully you can make this book. This is going to inform Honolulu architecture in the best way of looking back and going to the future. And then the products of that will be then, documented by this awesome photographer. So with that, with this vision, I think we should close the show. Thank you very much for your visit. You're going straight back to Taiwan tomorrow, going back to teach. Thank you so very much for having been here and having inspired us all.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So thank you very much for having been with us today. Again, next week is going to be Urban Transcendence again, and it's going to be Thomas Lim talking about the bigger picture. See you then.